The carriage door slammed shut, and Duke Alaric Thorne felt the walls of his own life closing in around him. He had 1 month to marry or lose everything his family had built for 200 years. His grandfather's lawyer sat across from him, reading the final terms of the will in a flat, unshaken voice, as if he were reading a grocery list instead of destroying a man's freedom. Alaric gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles turning white. There was only one woman on the approved list who would agree to marry him on such short notice, and she was the last person on earth he wanted to face again. Lady Wynne Ashford stood in her family's crumbling drawing room, staring at a letter that smelled of expensive ink and old money. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the proposal, not from excitement, but from the memory of a ballroom years ago, when Alaric had laughed at her in front of every noble family in the region. He had called her dress plain, her manners dull, and her presence forgettable. Now his name was asking for her hand, and her family's crushing debts were begging her to say yes. She folded the letter, closed her eyes, and made a decision that had nothing to do with love. The wedding was arranged within days, cold and efficient, like a business deal rather than a union of two hearts. Guests whispered behind painted fans, wondering how the proud Duke had been brought so low that he needed the woman he once mocked to save his name. Wynne walked down the aisle with her chin held high, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Alaric stood at the altar, jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past her shoulder, unwilling to meet her gaze even as the priest asked him to take her hand. Throughout the ceremony, not a single warm word passed between them. Vows were spoken like recitations, empty of feeling, heavy with obligation. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Alaric offered her his arm out of duty, not affection, and Wynne took it because refusing would only humiliate them both further in front of watching eyes. The carriage ride back to his estate was silent, filled only with the sound of wheels grinding against stone and the distant call of evening birds. Inside the grand halls of Thorne Manor, servants bowed and scattered, unsure how to treat their new mistress. Alaric disappeared into his study without a word, leaving Wynne standing alone in a house that did not yet feel like home. She wandered through unfamiliar corridors, touching cold marble and faded portraits of ancestors who seemed to judge her with painted eyes. She told herself this marriage was simply a transaction, a shield against poverty, nothing more. Yet somewhere beneath her calm exterior, a quiet ache reminded her that she had married a man who still saw her as beneath his notice, and that pain was far heavier than any debt her family had ever owed. The candle in the bedroom flickered low as Alaric entered, expecting silence or perhaps tears from the woman he had married out of necessity. Instead, Wynne sat calmly by the window, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She did not rise to greet him, nor did she lower her eyes in the way he expected from a bride desperate to please. Her stillness unsettled him more than any outburst could have, and he found himself standing awkwardly near the door, unsure of what was expected of him in a marriage built on nothing but paperwork and pride. Wynne turned to face him fully, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. She asked him a question that seemed simple on the surface, yet struck him like a blow he had not braced for. She wanted to know whether he hated her, or whether he hated the memory of his own cruelty toward her. Alaric opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He had expected accusations, perhaps even anger, but not this calm, piercing honesty that left him with nowhere to hide. He turned away from her, pretending to study the fireplace, buying himself time to gather thoughts that refused to form into sentences. Every sharp reply he considered felt hollow the moment it reached his tongue. Wynne did not press him further. She simply waited, her patience somehow louder than any demand could have been. That silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut, and Alaric realized he was the one holding his breath, not her. Memories of that humiliating ballroom night resurfaced uninvited, his own laughter echoing cruelly in his mind, as he recalled mocking her dress in front of people who mattered far less than he had believed at the time. He remembered the flicker of hurt in her eyes that night, quickly hidden behind practiced composure. He had told himself back then that her feelings were unimportant, that his opinion carried more weight than her dignity. Standing in this quiet room years later, that belief felt suddenly foolish and unkind. Wynne rose slowly, walked toward the door leading to her own chamber, and paused just before leaving. She told him gently that she did not expect an answer that night, nor did she require his affection to fulfill her role as his wife. She only wished for honesty when he was ready to give it. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Alaric alone with a silence that felt heavier than any argument could have been. He sat by the dying fire long after she left, turning her question over and over in his mind like a stone he could not put down. For the first time since his grandfather's decree, his anger toward his circumstances faded into something closer to shame. He had expected a broken, desperate bride grateful for his name and title. Instead, he had married a woman whose quiet strength exposed the emptiness of his own pride, and that realization surprised him more than losing his estate ever had. Weeks passed at Thorn Manor, and Alaric found himself watching Wynne in ways he never expected. He noticed how she rose early to review the estate ledgers, correcting mistakes his own stewards had ignored for months. He noticed how the kitchen staff smiled when she entered the room, a warmth none of them had ever shown toward him. She never asked for his praise, never sought his approval, and that quiet independence stirred something uncomfortable and unfamiliar inside his chest. One afternoon, he found her in the garden, kneeling beside an old groundskeeper who struggled to lift a heavy sack of grain. Without hesitation, she helped him carry it, ignoring the dirt that stained her sleeves. Alaric watched from a distance, unseen, as she laughed gently at something the old man said, her joy completely unguarded in that private moment. He realized he had never once seen her laugh in his presence, and the thought left him strangely hollow. That evening, a letter arrived from his cousin, Edmund, requesting a visit to discuss family matters. Alaric agreed, unaware that Edmund's true intention was to undermine the marriage and reclaim the inheritance for himself. Edmund arrived with false charm, praising the estate while quietly planting doubts among the household staff about Wynne's background and her suitability as a duchess. Alaric, distracted by his own conflicted feelings, failed to notice the subtle poison his cousin was spreading through whispered conversations. Wynne, however, sensed the shift immediately. Servants who once greeted her warmly began avoiding her gaze, and hushed conversations stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. She said nothing to Alaric at first, unwilling to appear as though she needed his protection. Instead, she quietly investigated the source of the sudden coldness herself, speaking gently with the younger maids until one nervous girl finally admitted what Edmund had been saying behind closed doors. That night, Wynne confronted Alaric calmly, laying out everything she had learned without a trace of accusation in her voice. She simply presented the facts, allowing him to draw his own conclusions. Alaric felt a flash of anger, not at her, but at himself for failing to see what was happening under his own roof. He realized that despite his cold distance, some protective instinct toward her had already taken root without his permission. He assured her that he would address his cousin's behavior, though he could not yet explain the strange urgency he felt to defend her honor. Wynne studied his face for a long moment, searching for sincerity behind his words. She thanked him quietly, then excused herself for the evening, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable truth that his feelings toward her were shifting into something far more complicated than the resentment he had carried into this marriage. For the first time, he wanted to prove himself worthy of her trust, not because duty demanded it, but because something deeper inside him had quietly begun to care. The great hall buzzed with quiet gossip when Edmund gathered several noble guests for an evening of cards and wine, using the occasion to spread further doubts about Wynne's character. He suggested, with practiced subtlety, that she had married Alaric purely for wealth and title, hinting that her humble background made her unfit to manage a household of such standing. Several guests nodded along, enjoying the scandal more than they cared about its truth, unaware that Alaric stood just beyond the doorway, listening to every carefully crafted lie. Something inside him snapped in that moment, a fierce protectiveness he had not known he possessed. He stepped into the room without hesitation, his presence silencing the laughter instantly. He addressed his cousin directly, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, stating clearly that any further attempts to insult his wife would not be tolerated under his roof. The guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power, while Edmund's confident smile faltered for the first time that evening. Wynne, standing quietly near the entrance, watched the exchange with wide, disbelieving eyes. She had expected indifference from Alaric, perhaps even silent agreement with his cousin's cruel remarks. Instead, she witnessed him defend her honor in front of the very people whose opinions had once meant everything to him. When their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile understanding neither of them was ready to name aloud. Later that night, Alaric found her in the library, staring blankly at a book she was not truly reading. He sat across from her, and for the first time since their wedding, he spoke without guarding his words. He admitted that his cruelty toward her years ago had stemmed from his own insecurities, a desperate need to feel powerful in a world where he often felt inadequate beneath the weight of his family's expectations. He confessed that hurting her had never brought him satisfaction, only a hollow victory he had long regretted in silence. Wynne listened without interrupting, her expression softening with each honest word he offered. When he finished, she reached across the small distance between them and gently touched his hand, a simple gesture that carried more warmth than any grand declaration could have. She told him that she appreciated his honesty more than any apology, and that trust, though fragile, could still be rebuilt between two people willing to try. In the days that followed, Edmund's schemes unraveled entirely, exposed by servants willing to speak once they saw their duke stand firmly beside his wife. He was sent away from the estate in disgrace, his influence over the household completely destroyed. Alaric and Wynne, meanwhile, found themselves speaking more freely with each other, sharing quiet meals and unhurried conversations that slowly chipped away at the walls each had built out of necessity. What began as a forced arrangement was slowly transforming into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Months had passed since Edmund's disgrace, and Thorn Manor felt entirely different from the cold, silent house Wynne had first entered as a reluctant bride. Servants greeted her with genuine warmth, no longer hesitant or watchful, and the estate itself seemed to breathe easier under her steady management. Alaric, once distant and guarded, now sought her opinion on matters both large and small, valuing her judgment in ways he never imagined possible when their marriage began as nothing more than a desperate arrangement. One crisp morning, a formal gathering was held to celebrate the successful harvest season, drawing nobles and neighbors from across the region. Wynne moved through the crowd with quiet confidence, no longer the woman mocked at a ballroom years earlier, but a respected duchess admired for her wisdom and kindness. Alaric watched her from across the courtyard, struck once again by how completely his perception of her had changed since that humiliating night he wished he could take back. During a quiet pause in the celebrations, Alaric found her near the garden fountain, away from the noise and attention of their guests. He took her hand gently, something he would never have done in the early days of their marriage, and asked if she remembered the question she had posed to him on their wedding night. Wynne smiled softly, admitting she remembered every word, having wondered for weeks whether he would ever truly answer it. He told her with complete sincerity that he no longer hated her, nor did he carry the shame of his old cruelty the way he once had. Instead, he confessed that she had become the person whose opinion mattered most to him, someone he genuinely respected, and though the word still felt new on his tongue, someone he had grown to love. Wynne's eyes glistened with unshed tears, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hearing words she had quietly hoped for without daring to expect them. She admitted in turn that her own feelings had shifted long before she was willing to acknowledge them, growing from cautious respect into genuine affection as she watched him defend her, listened to her, and slowly become a better man than the arrogant young duke she once knew. Their conversation was simple, free of grand declarations or dramatic gestures, yet it carried more truth than any elaborate promise could have offered. As the sun began to set over Thorn Manor, casting warm golden light across the courtyard, Alaric and Wynne returned to their guests, walking side by side as true partners rather than strangers bound by obligation. Their marriage, born from a decree neither had chosen, had transformed into something neither had believed possible, a bond built on honesty, respect, and quiet, hard-earned love. What started as a forced union had become, in every way that mattered, a story of genuine devotion, proving that even the coldest beginnings could grow into something warm and lasting.